The House of the Devil is a silent film directed by Georges Méliès in 1896 and is often cited as the first horror film in the new medium of motion pictures. Fast forward 127 years later to 1993 and the release of the first collectible card game Magic: The Gathering. Its first set, Alpha, was designed in a way that played off nearly every fantasy trope available, from knights to mages and dwarves to dragons. But among these cards there was something darker lurking within. Demons with pentagrams scrawled upon their forehead, skeletons riding undead horses, and ritualistic sacrifice. While over a century separates the House of the Devil and the introduction of Magic: The Gathering, both represent a first go at horror in their respective mediums. Both are rudimentary compared to what would come, but both show a devotion to the idea of bringing fear to life. This is Magic: The Gathering's timeline of horror. "1993 saw the release of Alpha and is the beginning of what I would define as the classic era of horror and Magic, one that spanned to the year 2007. This era is most notably characterized by a grotesque artistic style, one that permeated through every set. Horror art, like all art during the earliest years of this game, was an avenue walked by artists with free rein to dig into whatever concepts they wanted, as the art direction in the first years was very loose, if not anything more than a name of a card.
But when we first started out, we were given like the titles of the artwork, and we were pretty much free to come up with whatever we wanted as far as imagery. Nowadays, it's a bit more sort of balanced. Sometimes occasionally you get like one where you have a lot of freedom, but there's a lot of still specific things you have to sort of follow.
Because of this artistic freedom, each artist was allowed to let their imaginations take them wherever they desired. Sometimes you could say this was to a fault, as this era does bring with it cards that history hasn't looked too kindly on, but are a result of a time with little left on the table. The card Invoke Prejudice being possibly the most famous example. Within this first era of Magic, there were many artists who helped define what horror looked and felt like, but of them, one of the most memorable was Mark Tedden. His portfolio during this era and his work, which spanned into the second, was some of the game's best, with cards like the Sickening Abomination, the ever-iconic Mind Stab Thrall, the repulsive Mind Ravel, the unsettling Kami of Twisted Reflection, and I could go on and on. In the following year after Magic's release, in 1994, we would be introduced to one of Magic's longest-standing villains in the set, Antiquities, with the cards Phyrexian Gremlins and Priest of Yawgmoth. These Phyrexians were a spawn of Yawgmoth, the Thran eugenist convinced that perfection in beings could be achieved through artifice and the reorganization of organic flesh. This sentiment is something that would carry on to their current design. This concept of modifying one's own body with biomechanical enhancements. Thus, body horror would be a reoccurring theme all throughout. Though in these earliest years, the art direction for these creatures held little thematic relation. I wouldn't say that this style of horror, this body horror, took hold until Urza's Saga, and that is where their common themes would truly arise. Defined by artists like Pete Venters on Flesh Reaver, Eviscerator by Michael Sutphin, and Phyrexian Monitor by Carl Critchlow. Speaking to the latter of these three, Carl Critchlow was an iconic artist who has provided masterful works of terror for more than just Phyrexians, and whose work bridges into the present day. Carl had a particularly astute sensibility for revolting monsters, exemplified by his work on cards like Exhume, Kataran Slaver, Leveler, and Razorjaw Oni. Carl's extensive history working in the comic book industry on such dark classics as Judge Dredd and Flash is something that shines through in a lot of his work he does for Magic: The Gathering. Later, in 1994, would see the release of the set The Dark, which I consider Magic's first attempt at a horror set, though I would be hesitant to call it a resounding success. It was a set whose themes revolved around the blacking out of the sun and the resulting persecution that took place. While it was the first set to feature dark themes in every color, with the card Tividar's Crusade being one of the greatest examples of this. The set still lacked a complete, cohesive sense of self. What I mean is that while there were great examples of horror in every color, many of the cards felt like they could have been in any time or place. Nonetheless, horror, demonic imagery, and vile acts would continue to be a defining part of this era, with examples found in every set. Enfeeblement from Mirage painting a picture of hopelessness and suffering. Sleeper's Guile from Urza's Legacy, an act of blood-curdling mutilation, and Reclusive White from Urza's Saga evoking pain and torment. The art of these formative years never shied away from the shocking, and the fear it fostered wasn't that of the shadow behind the door, but rather that of a visceral reaction that could be felt at one's core, like the gory exploitative horror films of the 70s. There wasn't anything sophisticated being fostered here, just extreme acts and horrifying creatures. 2004 would change everything though, with the onset of the Champions of Kamigawa block. In it were masterful depictions of darker themes that felt unique to the plane, and built upon a cohesive, thematic, and unsettling world. This feudal Japanese-inspired plane wasn't a horror set per se, but rather had art direction that leaned into the unnerving and odd in a cohesive manner. It was a plane that felt alien in so many ways, a setting swirling with unnatural magic and forms. The kami who populated this plane were manifestations of this very notion, their bodies a mockery of the human form, as if they were attempting a shape the host would not allow. It was a time in the era where a shift was beginning to take place, one that held the influences of vintage magic art, while moving in a direction that favored a singular throughput for themes and setting.
Ravnica, where ancient guilds rule a city that covers the world. For 10,000 years, their sacred laws protected the peace and cast light in the darkness. But nothing lasts forever. Not even the guilds of Ravnica.
Magic the Gathering would then follow up the Kamigawa block with our first trip to Ravnica in 2005, an honestly awful place, one where dark streets held danger, corruption and violence were at every turn. Within these walls, ruthless judges handed out death sentences on false charges. Ghostly clergymen consumed the souls of their parishioners, and a young woman's body hung from the town square. The card Martyr Rusalka reading, Rakdos cultists hung her for sport in the township square. Her ghost now stands vigil at what has become known as the Tree of Weeping. Ravnica was dirty, dangerous, and a vile place, with few guilds without any blood on their hands, one where ghastly ghouls haunted the halls and abominations crawled underground. I consider Ravnica a test of where Magic the Gathering's sensibilities are at for any given era. As a cornerstone of Magic's identity, you can glean much from how it is represented, and this first visit was the darkest the plane would ever feel. The years would continue on with the trends of the previous, with horror creeping into every set. It had been something which had ingrained itself into Magic's identity. Sets like Cold Snap circa 2006 would produce the hauntingly beautiful yet macabre art of Feast of Flesh by Vulcan Baga, or the cruel grisly card Yxlid Jailer from Future Sight from 2007. It was almost a selling point of Magic the Gathering during this era, and is still fondly remembered for not being shy when it came to gory, dark, and unsavory imagery. While we look back at this kind of art as nothing more than some fun and shocking pieces, we do have to put into context the time period this all took place within. This era, namely the early years, was a time when there was increasing scrutiny towards media that portrayed violence and demonic imagery.
The evidence is in. Satan worship and satanic cults are growing rapidly.
There's two different communities that use this park. One is the pagan or occultic community, and the other community is, of course, the homosexual community.
The children are developing relationships with all these Pokemon creatures.
And on that card, it showed spiritual beings actually being risen up out of the ground, out of their grave. And then he asked his mother, "What does summon mean?" And she said, "Why do you ask that?" And she said, he told her, he said, because all the kids on recess go outside on the school grounds, pick up huge sticks, wave them in the air, and say, "Spirits, enter me."
During the 90s, America was going through a second wave of satanic panic, where fear over children interacting with black magic, dark fantasy, and satanic imagery riled up the masses in fear that their children would become Satan worshippers. I know it sounds absurd to us now, but this was a real issue that the game had to deal with, one that Dungeons & Dragons knew all too well during the 80s. This topic is a video unto itself, so if you want to learn more, I would suggest you watch this amazing video by Jake and Joel or Magic. The issues surrounding Magic the Gathering and its perceived attempt to pull children towards the occult was so bad that the demon creature type was shelved for many years around this time just to get ahead of any controversies it may cause. To that end, Mark Rosewater reflected on this change in his 2004 article, "Where Have All the Demons Gone?" To which he said,
"So why did demons go away in Magic? Because it seemed like a safe choice in a very unsafe time. Magic was on the cusp of becoming a highly public game. Wizards knew what had happened to D&D when it went through that phase. And remember, at the time, Wizards of the Coast's welfare rested squarely on the shoulders of Magic. We had not yet bought TSR and thus D&D. We had not yet had successes in other trading card games. Wizards was about to make the biggest gamble of its life, and so it took some precautions."
Having grown up in a very religious family myself, I was always acutely aware of the art on any given Magic card, and made sure to avoid showing my mother any such cards, lest she take them all away from me, which resulted in me playing a lot of white. Maybe that's why white is my least favorite color to play to this day. Of course, such fears would lessen around Magic, and it was then open to experimenting more with horror, so much so that I believe it came out of the whole experience better, which brought us into a golden age of horror for the game, in what I call the Renaissance era. This era began with Shadowmoor in 2008 and lasted through until late 2020. During this time, Magic started to explore horror themes in a more nuanced and complex manner. There's a greater focus on building worlds and sets with varied horror themes in mind. The Lorwyn Shadowmoor block, with its shift from a whimsical setting to a darker, twisted one, exemplified this change. Sets like Innistrad delved deep into gothic horror. Rise of the Eldrazi introduced us to the cosmic horrors of the Blind Eternities, and New Phyrexia has produced a fresh, more twisted version of an old threat. Shadowmoor marks the beginning of this era, as it's the first since the Dark where you can sense horror throughout the plane, and in each color. It's in the large hollow eyes of the Kithkin, the diabolical nature of the fairy folk, and the ever-increasing hopelessness that permeates the plane. The Desecrator Hag with her circular teeth is something that has always stuck with me from the moment I saw it. Around this time, we'd be introduced to the artist Stephen Belladin, who started making art for Magic the Gathering and Cold Snap, even crafting the iconic Treacherous Urge in Planar Chaos. But his contributions to horror and art in general really took off in this second era, with art like Unmake, Deathmark, and Surgical Extraction being some of Magic's most standout and blood-curdling horror pieces.
Any favorites yourself? Pieces you're just really proud of that have held up over the years?
Yeah, I think my favorite, and it will be for quite some time, I think, is still Surgical Extraction. That's easily my favorite painting I've ever done for Magic. It was this weird blend of there was something personal to it about it that I could really, bring out of the piece, sure. And it was just completely within my wheelhouse. I knew exactly what to do with it as soon as I got the assignment.
His work on Innistrad really helped sell the horror themes of the plane with cards like Sensory Deprivation, Narstad's Scrapper, and Invasive Surgery. His art was always a league above, and I doubt this era would have had such an impact without him. Following the Lorwyn Shadowmoor block came the Alara block, and while most of the shards had a lighter or more high fantasy touch, the hellscape that was the Grixis shard was a feast for the eyes for those inclined to the brutal suffering that brought with it. Cards like Shadow Feed by Dave Kendall, are an example of that old school brutality mixed with the forward-thinking style that was on the horizon, a notion that was also showcased on the masterfully abysmal Grixis slave driver. My favorite of this block, though, will always be that of Sidraxis Alchemist by Karl Kopinski. Kopinski is an artist who has a keen eye for anatomy, which he uses with visceral detail to bring to life gory yet wholly beautiful works of art that feel real, adding to the horror of everything he does. He began his journey as a magic artist during the Alara block, and everyone could already see his penchant for horror was a level beyond most. His portfolio of horror art would continue to be unmatched, adding cards like the brutal Undead Minotaur from M14, or most notably his work on Vorinclex in New Phyrexia. Kopinski isn't always given horror projects, but when he is, it's sure to be a feast of the macabre. In 2010, we would come face to face with a new kind of horror for Magic the Gathering, that of the cosmic, with the release of Rise of the Eldrazi.
The Eldrazi are unfathomable, unknowable. That is kind of their whole shtick. They are otherworldly. They're not even from physical space.
You could say things like unknowable. You could say inscrutable. You could say, beyond our comprehension. But ultimately,
these unfeeling monsters, evocative of H.P. Lovecraft's work, felt fresh and new in the hands of the artists and designers. It was a task that could have been derivative and yet felt original, all while capturing the essence of that which hides in the vastness of our own space. These creatures appeared to serve as a connection between divine beings and corporeal abominations. Mark Tedden returned once again to bring his masterful stroke when designing Emrakul, the standout of the three titans. Not long after, 2011 marked the return of Magic's oldest threat, with the sets Mirrodin Besieged and New Phyrexia. But this time, something was different. In the classic era, the Phyrexians were a manifestation of black mana, twisted fiends of morbid mutilation. These new Phyrexians now encompass the entire color pie, skewing their identity in different ways. Elish Norn being the most notable of them all. The Grand Cenobite like a priestess of pain, her skin flayed and topped with porcelain. 2011 would also mark the introduction of Magic's true horror-first plane. The designers may have brought horror to each plane in one form or another, or have crafted worlds that were unsettling by their very nature, but Innistrad is horror first in everything it does. As a setting, it stands firm in its intent. As such, the designers leaned into every classic Gothic horror trope they could find, a style of design we would come to see more and more of in the future, in that they leaned into what we already knew to help solidify the setting.
But Mark Rosewater kind of took the ball and ran with it with Innistrad with the Gothic horror theme, and really pulled all the tribes together, plus all these other different tropes, and started his design that way. And I was pretty blown away by how it turned out. The fact that, and we're hearing compliments left and right.
As such, the plane is filled with hedonistic vampires, vicious werewolves and eerie ghosts, mad scientists and decomposing zombies. This block had a lot of weight on its shoulders as well, as it had to deliver a true horror set while coming after two sets that leaned into horror quite heavily. In fact, it is a challenge the art director at the time, Jeremy Jarvis, speaks to in this article, praising the art for Innistrad. In it, he revealed how they took deliberate steps to ensure each set had a horror feel, but worked with vastly different themes in order to ensure that they stood on their own, even working with different art mediums to achieve this, which really goes to show their dedication to ensuring uniqueness of feel.
I've talked before about using the stable of illustrators working on a given setting to reinforce that setting's visual goals. New Phyrexia was rife with digital painters, not only to really sell the terrible sheen of metal, but also so I could redirect for the look of Innistrad, which is a more grounded, relatable, and straightforward place, and would benefit from a more traditionally painted feel.
With such a focus on horror over the course of 3 straight years, the Magic team took a bit of a break on focusing on such sets, though like with every set, darkness still permeated each plane. In 2012, we returned to Ravnica, though this venture felt less dark than our previous visit, but only in comparison to what came before, as it was still a plane where the Rakdos and Orzhov guilds brought with it sinister themes. In 2015, we saw the release of the Battle for Zendikar block, two sets which added to the ever-expanding canon of the Eldrazi. With the variants afforded by this creature type by their very nature, each instance of them upon a plane manages to still feel fresh, as the artists are able to take these entities in many directions, from the bizarre fleshy sacks of the Eldrazi Sky Spawner to the kaleidoscope of oily colors in the card Kozilek's Translator. The Eldrazi will always spark both imagination and fear whenever they're present in a set, though it would prove to be too much in a short span the coming year.
Remember that time when you were a human on Innistrad and all you had to worry about was spirits, vampires, werewolves and zombies? Happy.
2016 would mark Magic's second take on its classic horror plane Innistrad, with the Shadows over Innistrad block, a pair of sets who would aim to tap into both gothic horror and Lovecraftian horror, a mix that may have proven to be an oversaturation of ideas, and as such didn't accomplish either with any certainty. In the first set of the block, Shadows over Innistrad, we got the plane we have come to expect, with all the trappings of classic horror, but with the follow-up Eldritch Moon, adding Emrakul to the mix seemed to push out what made Innistrad interesting, for more of what we had already dealt with in the previous year. This is really where I would say the issue lies though, as I feel if we got more of a break before reintroducing an Eldrazi Titan again, it may have had more impact. Perhaps if they waited a couple more years, it would have been more exciting at the time. Alternatively, they could have taken a lighter touch and simply leaned more into the idea of madness gripping the plane. An example drawn to the most famous of this style, Lovecraft, who often does this with his short stories, in regards to his old gods, in that he provides horror through their influence rather than through their direct presence. In 2017, we'd be introduced to the plane of Amonkhet, a plane with a dark mystery behind it, and a lingering death all throughout it. Death is the key theme here, a sort of dread that hovers over everything, be it the endless sands that surround the city, or the rites of passage where death is the reward. Amonkhet, in this first set, had something special, and when the designers can pull off this more nuanced sense of dread, one which permeates through the entire plane, then we as the players are more invested in the mysteries behind it all. With the Hour of Devastation, the veil was cracked, and something was lost. From Ixalan in 2017 and on, horror would take a back seat, perhaps due to an oversaturation from all the previous blocks. Even our third take on Ravnica would be a watered-down version from even the second visit, with each guild no longer having the bite they once did. Even Rakdos felt nowhere near the same as it once had. I think back to the act of the Hanged Girl, her body on display for no other reason than the whims of this guild. Now Rakdos, while dark, was little more than a morbid circus. Throne of Eldraine managed to work in some very interesting pieces of horror by leaning into the grim fairy tales, but I would never call it a horror set in any regard. In Theros Beyond Death circa 2020, there would be some unsettling and supernatural takes on the plane's version of the afterlife, but beyond that, there was a noticeable shift towards placing horror-first sets on the back burner. This isn't to say that the latter years of this era did not produce some amazing horror pieces. No, quite the opposite. The artists providing work for some of the more macabre cards in the game were producing artwork that stood above much of what came before. But such were the exception and no longer the rule. There was a shift happening, where a glossy sheen had slipped over everything in the game, which acted to dull some of the game's rougher and harsher edges. It was at this point it really set in that Magic was changing. It wasn't anywhere near as dark as it had been even 5 years prior. It was at this point in my research when I had to stop myself and ask why it felt that way. It was around this time in the latter 2010s and early 2020s that Magic was once again becoming a cultural touchstone. As such, I believe they wanted to shift their image and define themselves for a new era. If the Renaissance era brought with it greater focus on top-down horror design, then the next era would be the catalyst for a more nuanced take on horror. The year was 2021. The moon was full and werewolves lurked in the shadows, marking our return to the beloved horror plane of Innistrad. As a plane derived from variations of the horror genre, it decided to continue this tradition by making folk horror the focal point of its themes and design. As the humans of this plane could no longer rely on the angels, they turned from religion to wild and old magic. Among the common cast of characters was a heavy utilization of pagan traditions, old magic, and of course, werewolves. But something felt different this time. Though danger lurked around every corner, there was for the first time this feeling of hope. There was many more instances of humanity holding strong and taking back their land.
I feel like the inhabitants of Innistrad, right? You said whimsy. Does that mean that they're gonna have a party?
We haven't had a chance to ever show humans on Innistrad having a party. It's time for them to show off that they've got a little bit of lightheartedness, they have hope, they have come together, they will face the darkness together.
And while this made for a great story progression, to me the plane felt like it lost what made it frightening in the first place. If we look back to the first two blocks, humanity was in a state of absolute peril, which doused the setting in a sense of dread. Yet the dread was hardly felt here. Later that year, we would be given the second half of the block with Crimson Vow. Eternal darkness had swallowed the plane, strangeness and terror began to set in, but the focus of the marketing, story, and many of the cards was that of the wedding between Edgar Markov and Olivia Valderin. It was clear now to me where we were heading in terms of horror, and why this was a defining block marking the third era. All of this may sound like the modern era was shaping up to be child's play in comparison to what had come before, but it would be disingenuous for me to make that claim. There was a renewed art direction and world building happening here. In Crimson Vow, we were able to peer deeper into the vampire cultures of the plane. In both sets, green became something more than it had ever been in the past. This new focal point of pagan magic fit in perfectly with Innistrad. The humans were no longer these helpless cattle. There was this arc we had gone on with them. The plane itself had gone through so much and developed over the years. There was nuance in its design now, a matter of design that would push us forward into the future of horror in this game. One of the greatest additions to Magic the Gathering's stable of artists at this time was Dominic Mayer, whom had begun their journey in Zendikar Rising, but was one who first grabbed my attention in the third Innistrad block. Cards like Curse of Hospitality, Gift of Fangs, and his later work crafting the ink alternate art for All Will Be One. There are some artists that come along that demand your attention, and Mayer is one of those artists. I will be paying close attention to this artist going forward, and you should too. As the years went by, the new Phyrexians of Old Mirrodin started popping up from plane to plane. The story began to build in the background as we traveled the multiverse, until everything came to a head in Phyrexia All Will Be One, Magic's second horror set of the modern era. If New Phyrexia aimed to define this new version of an old foe, All Will Be One solidified their identity going forward. Just as with the last Innistrad block, the world building felt more its own, more refined. Each color was given enough cards and the space to really sell its own concept of the Phyrexian curse. This set alone holding on to some of Magic's greatest horror art thus far, with the Praetors and their followers exemplifying pain and suffering as a mode to bettering oneself. Machinations of torture were twisted into avenues of perfection. There's also direct comparison that can be made to Dante's Divine Comedy, with the layers of New Phyrexia mirroring the layers of Hell. A deliberate design choice of the art director of the set, Ovidia Cartagena. If the first era could be defined by a shock and gore style of horror, the modern era was a shift to a style that felt like it had grown up. It was mature and nuanced, and aimed to fulfill many different roles. It relied more on robust world building and a cohesive design. It's too early to say what the future of horror will look and feel like in Magic, but with a horror first set on the horizon in Duskmoon House of Horror, we'll soon find out. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this look at Magic's horror history. This was by far my biggest project yet, and if you would like to see more projects like this, then be sure to share with your friends, leave a like, and let me know your thoughts. If this does well enough, then perhaps there will be more larger documentaries or other timelines on this channel. I would also like to give a special thank you to my patrons who support me no matter where my work takes me. And with that, friends, I will catch you in the multiverse. Bye.